So welcome everybody to our BC Arts Funding 101 session. Today we're focusing specifically on upper level undergraduates in the Faculty of Fine Arts. So that's our students in the School of Music, Art History and Visual Studies, the Department of Writing, Department of Theatre, and of course the Department of Visual Arts. I'd like to welcome you all for making time to attend this today. I really appreciate that. And this session is also being recorded, so we will have it available for viewing after the fact as well. My name is John Threlfall, and I'm the Special Projects and Communications Officer for the Faculty of Fine Arts. I'll be your host for today's session. Before we begin, however, I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Quick word about the session for the format today, the format of today's session. Our guests will be speaking for about 30 minutes, during which time you're welcome to enter any questions you have in the chat box using the button at the bottom of your screen. Following the presentation, we'll shift to a Q&A format for the remainder of our time. I'll be monitoring the questions during the session, and we'll compile them all and then ask them to Erin at that time. I'd now like to introduce our guest speaker for today, BC Arts Council Program Officer Erin Macklem, who is also a graduate of our own Department of Theatre. Erin, for about 25 years, after working 25 years in professional theatre as a costume designer, playwright, and administrator, Erin Macklem now facilitates youth-focused multidisciplinary programs for the BC Arts Council. A member of the Metis Nation of BC and the Metis Nation of Greater Victoria, she strives to bring this cultural lens to her work while being conscious of the white skin privilege afforded by her father's Irish and English ancestors. Erin, I'll hand the whole thing over to you.
Thanks, John. Tasha Kiwan, Erin Macklem Dishnakoshan, Lekwungen Ototan. Hello, everybody. It's really good to be with you today. As John said, I'm a member of the Metis Nation of BC and Greater Victoria, and it's my great pleasure to be sharing some Michif language with you just now in my introduction, which I am in the process of reclaiming. I'm going to share my screen with you for sort of the more formal part of this presentation, and then I'm excited to, as John says, answer any questions that you might have. The screen sharing piece is always the most stressful aspect of any presentation, so give me a moment while I fumble through this here, and hopefully can get it up and running in 1 second. How's that, John? Are we up and running?
Looks good.
All right. Fantastic. So welcome. In this session, I just, here's what I hope to do is offer some context about the BC Arts Council. I've outlined the BC Arts Council's strategic plan and our funding priorities, and then briefly address the wide range of funding opportunities we offer with a bit of a focus on the scholarship and the early career development programs. We'll talk about eligibility considerations and some general tips for writing grants, and then we'll get to questions. So as I was preparing this presentation, I was thinking about it from two different perspectives. Primarily, I'm here as a program officer and the outreach coordinator for the BC Arts Council to talk you through funding opportunities that you may want to take advantage of. But secondarily, as John mentioned, I'm also a graduate of the UVic theater department. And so I was reflecting on where I was mentally when I was about to graduate, or in those upper level years from UVic before I entered the professional world. So I put together this slide just as a bit of a personal reflection to illustrate that I really had no idea where my career was going to take me, but I'm glad I was open to a variety of opportunities as they presented themselves, because everything I've done, and as you can see on this slide, it's quite a wide range of things, but everything has informed everything else that I've taken on in my career. I majored in set design while I was at UVic, and you'll notice that's not even on this list of things. It's not really something that I ended up focusing on when I graduated. It's not really a linear path. I spent about 10 years working in freelance, sometimes supplementing this work in other non-arts related jobs, as one has to do, especially when one comes out of a BFA with a $40,000 student loan, as I did. Clawed my way out of that. Spent about 12 years working for one theater company in town in Victoria here. That's the Belfry Theater, before launching into where I am now as a public servant, working for the province of BC for the BC Arts Council. As I was looking back, upon this sort of career path, one thing I wish I had known more about was grant writing. So that's a good segue into the rest of this presentation. So as you enter the world of grant writing, speaking generally, it's always good to have a sense of the funding agency's mandate and priorities before you dig into applying. And be aware that agencies' priorities can also shift and change over time. So it's good to check in on them often. And ask yourself, how does my work align with this funder's mandate and priorities? So, for example, specifically, the BC Arts Council is a funding agency for the provincial government. It's created by an act of legislation back in 1995 for the purposes of providing support for arts and culture in British Columbia. This is mostly through funding, but also through policy development and engagement with the arts and culture sector. B, providing persons and organizations with the opportunity to participate in the arts and culture in British Columbia. And then C, providing an open, accountable, and neutrally administered process for managing the funds for BC arts and culture. And this sort of a governmenty way of primarily referencing the peer assessment process, which is important to understand. So the BC Arts Council staff, people like me, we don't decide who receives the funding, with a couple of program exceptions. Primarily, these decisions are done through a peer assessment process where panels of folks who are currently working in the arts and culture sector, could be artists, arts administrators, cultural practitioners. These people are contracted to assess the applications, and they decide who's receiving funding. So hopefully someday some of you will be peer assessors. It would be great to work with you in that capacity as you are digging into your professional careers. So that's the BC Arts Council's mandate. It's pretty straightforward. It's a bit dry, maybe. We get into some more exciting nuances when we start to look at our strategic plan and strategic priorities. So this slide, I totally understand if you're looking at it and thinking, strategic plans, also dry. Boring, irrelevant. But what you need to be aware of is that the strategic plan guides all of the work that we do at the BC Arts Council. So it informs changes to existing programs. It informs the development of new programs. It informs who is eligible to apply for our programs and how programs are assessed, how applicants may be prioritized. So to offer some context here, back in 2018, the BC Arts Council released this new foundation's strategic plan that's to take the BC Arts Council through to 2022, which, wow, here we are. This articulates the vision, values, and strategic directions that you can see on this slide. And in the interest of time, I won't sort of read through all of them. But broadly speaking, the intention of the strategic plan was to facilitate a more equitable access to arts funding and to decolonize many of our programs and practices by focusing on these 4 strategic directions that you see in those colored triangles there. So I'll just kind of quickly dig into each of these priorities just for context for you. So under sustainability and creative development, these priorities are by the way, in no particular order of priority. But for sustainability and creative development, this means that we're trying to build upon our existing programs and create new programs that bolster support in specific areas to ensure that a diversity of artists and organizations are resilient, relevant, and well supported to build capacity and to create. And in this area, I will say that the last kind of year and a half have very much been focused on resilience and working with government to financially support the sector through the uncertainty and stable COVID period that we still find ourselves in. In Indigenous arts and culture, this yellow triangle, we're committed to deepening our engagement with the processes of decolonization and reconciliation, taking our lead from Indigenous artists, arts and culture organizations, and Indigenous communities, and respecting the principle of self-determination. So Indigenous artists and arts organizations are welcome and encouraged to apply to all our programs at the BC Arts Council. We do have increased eligibility for Indigenous arts and culture organizations. But I also want to highlight that in this area, we've increased investment in the First Peoples Cultural Council, who are an Indigenous-led Crown agency with whom the BC Arts Council has partnered for 25 years in the delivery of funding programs specifically to Indigenous arts and culture. So Indigenous artists and arts and culture organizations are eligible to apply to both BC Arts Council and First Peoples Cultural Council. We've highlighting that the investment with First Peoples Cultural Council has been vastly increased over the last couple of years. In this area of equity, diversity, and access, we're improving access to our programs, building principles of equity throughout the organization at every level to better support meaningful and genuine forms of diversity. And we'll continue this work through collaboration and co-creation with underserved communities. That's what's stated as the objectives in our strategic plan. So in this area, we've endorsed an equity framework developed with an external equity consultant named Sheila James, who's done a lot of this work with Canada Council as well. And we've begun implementing the recommendations from that process. And there's a lot more information about that on our website through our annual report. If you're interested in digging into that, let me know. I can provide more information and provide the link to more work in that area. And then lastly, the regional arts and community arts piece. This is focusing on the diversity of both professional arts and community arts in the province. We want to make sure that arts funding is supporting arts and culture throughout the province, not just in the major urban centers. And so this is one of the key priorities that is part of this current strategic plan. So I hope that this first really quick run through of the presentation gives you a sense of who the BC Arts Council is and what our priorities are. I'm going to move on from some of these more nuanced aspirational pieces into a quick tour of some of the funding opportunities offered by the BC Arts Council. You'll see that roughly these fall into grants that are available to individuals, which I'll spend more time on because that's who you are today, but there's also many grants available to organizations, which I will just quickly go over. I'll get into the rationale behind why I would spend any time on that when we get to that piece. So this slide gives you a brief sense of the programs available to individuals. It's just a selection of programs that show a bit of a trajectory for different areas of one's career. So some of our programs for individuals are focused on professional development. So scholarship is professional development in the early stages of one's career. Early career development takes you sort of through that period of the early part of your professional career, and how do you kind of take those leaps from there into becoming more established. And professional development is for, once you're well into your career, if there's workshops that you want to take or mentorships to pursue or residencies, that's a program that can support those kinds of activities. So other of our programs are focused on creation. So if you have a particular project that you want to work on, something you want to produce or create, we have programs available across disciplines for those as well. And other programs are focused on touring, though these have largely been on hold since COVID hit. So just to tell you a little bit more in detail about the scholarship program, for those of you that are in third year or hoping to further pursue studies after you complete your BFA, these are awards of up to $6,000 per year, available to BC residents to attend full-time post-secondary arts training, or to pursue high school half-day dance programs, which there are some of in the province. It's the oldest program that the BC Arts Council runs. It's been running since even prior to the inception of the BC Arts Council. The Early Career Development Program is one of the programs that I facilitate in my role. And as the name suggests, it acts as a launch pad for early career artists, arts administrators, cultural practitioners, technicians, this kind of thing. And it's one of the programs that both individuals and organizations can apply to. So if you as an individual are interested in pursuing a mentorship with somebody specifically to advance your practice, or if there's a in-depth residency that you want to pursue, these early career development awards are fairly substantial. They can cover a year's worth of activity. You can request up to $30,000. So they're worth investigating for sure. And it's also one of the programs that organizations can also apply to. So if, for example, there's an organization that you would be interested in doing an internship with, then the organization could apply to hire you as an intern. So it's good to be aware from both of those sides of the coin there. Yeah, and then speaking to the creation and development of new work, we've got individual awards for studio artists. So there's media arts awards, visual arts awards, creative writing arts awards for things that you want to create that are specifically focused on creation and less on learning. And then we have awards for in the performing arts side of things, project assistance awards for creation. I'm not 100% sure why we've divided them up in this particular way, why performing artists don't have their own individual sort of performing arts awards program. They function the same way, they support the same activities, but they're just divided into those two different pieces. Each of these programs is run by a program officer or a team of program officers whose contact information you can find in the program guidelines or on the program webpage for all our programs. So just to dig into a little bit who can be funded by these individual programs, this is a really long list. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but you can scan through and see if you see yourself in there. Eligible artists and arts or cultural practitioners may include but are not limited to these practices or roles that you see in this slide, but this list it's not conclusive. We appreciate that. Arts takes a village, and we know there's many varieties of arts professionals out there. So if you don't see yourself in this list and you are wondering if the work that you do might be eligible to some of our programs, just give the BC Arts Council a shout, and we're happy to walk through what you do and where it might fit into our funding opportunities. So this slide, as you can see, we offer many programs for organizations. Roughly speaking, these fall into two categories. Project assistance supports specific activities and initiatives and the expenses directly associated with those particular activities. And then we have operating assistance, which provides ongoing support for BC-based nonprofit arts and cultural organizations, and for-profit book publishers also fall into that realm as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, as I said, because I know you are all individuals and likely not representing organizations, but I think it's good for you to have a sense of some of these programs, because as you get out there in the world and you interact with organizations or Indigenous nations or friendship centers or Métis chartered communities who are also eligible to apply to the programs if they're doing arts and cultural activities, it's good for you to be aware of them so that you can let these organizations know if they're not already aware of them, and thereby maybe find yourself some funding to do some activities that, while you aren't eligible to apply for, the organization might be eligible to get some funds. Each of these programs has specific eligibility criteria based on the type of applicant and the type of activity. So again, you can find more information on all of these pieces on our website. So I just want to take a minute to talk about eligibility, because before you spend time crafting an application, which is, it's a significant commitment of your time and energy to submit a grant application, you want to be sure that you're eligible to apply and receive funding through whichever program. And you also want to be sure that your activities are eligible to be funded. So I'm going to walk you through eligibility considerations in two parts: who can be funded and what can be funded. And we'll start with who. So to be eligible, an applicant generally must be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident who has resided in BC for 12 months prior to applying and ordinarily resides in BC. So I know that especially as students, there can be some sort of gray area in this residency piece. We do have a link on our website called Determining BC Residency, which does kind of walk through some of those nuances. But if you if that doesn't answer your questions and you need more information, just check in with anybody at the Arts Council. Obviously, as a provincial funder, our priority is to fund provincial residents. Other pieces to consider beyond that, each program is going to have their own program eligibility, but for scholarships, for example, you need to be at least 15 years old, you need to be a full-time student, you need to be enrolled full-time in relevant supported arts and culture programs at recognized post-secondary institutions. And again, greater details about what constitutes full-time enrollment and what programs are eligible and what institutions are eligible, all outlined in the program guidelines. And then our other programs are very much focused on supporting professional artists. And so those pieces for eligibility would include the fact that you have completed your basic training, that you're not sort of doing those things concurrently, having demonstrated professional status for at least 2 years in your profession. And again, the guidelines can help identify how we determine what that professional status is, but it means you have to be paid for your work, and it means you have to be paid at industry standards. So those pieces might include CARFAC fees if you're sort of in the visual art realm, or fees like that are established by Canadian Actors Equity or the Canadian Theatre Agreement, or any of those kind of discipline-specific industry standards that have been laid out. So not honorariums or sort of gestures of smaller honorariums and such. We're intended to be supporting professionals. And then again, look to the guidelines for any other specific eligibility pieces, but those are kind of the primary ones to be aware of. So what can be funded? The considerations here, you want to again check the program guidelines to determine what activities can be funded by each program, what expenses are eligible to be funded through each program, and then pay attention to, usually there's a list of exclusions or what won't be funded in eligible activities and expenses. They're always going to be identified in detail in the guidelines as well. We don't want you to spend a whole bunch of time applying for something that isn't actually eligible to be supported. So as a general rule, things like capital expenses are excluded, and that would mean you can't use a grant to buy a new laptop computer, is often one that we get questions about, for example. Things that have a life to support your career beyond the particular project at hand are generally considered to be capital expenses, and are not generally not supported through the programs that we offer. But all manner of other activities are. So again, it's very dependent upon each individual program. So I thought I would take a little bit of a time to look at grant writing tips before we move into some questions, to just help set you up for success when approaching a grant application. The grant applications, they're done online. It's like filling information in boxes. It can sometimes be kind of overwhelming, and I completely appreciate that. But if you think of it as telling your story, and as folks working in fine arts, this is something that you're very familiar with. The medium that you choose to tell your stories through can be different, but writing a grant is kind of the same thing. You want to cover the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your activity. What you're doing is important, and a lot of people are actually really great at explaining what they're doing, when they're doing it, where they're doing it. But sometimes it can be trickier to articulate how you're doing it and the why of why you're doing it. And sometimes even the nuances of who, which are important in grant applications, can be trickier. So to break that down a little bit, why you're doing something is really key. You want to be able to articulate in your application, why are you doing this? Why is this important? Why is it important right now at this particular point in time? If you think about being able to broadly answer, why me? Why should I receive this funding? Why this project? Why is this project really important for me to be doing? And why now? Why is this the right moment in time to be taking on this work? Who is involved in the project is often fairly straightforward. It might just be you or people you're collaborating with, but other considerations in who can be who is going to be impacted by this work. Often this idea of impact and what's being impacted, who's being impacted, are really key parts of the assessment criteria. So you might want to think about who in terms of Is it just you that's being impacted by this activity that you're working on? Do you have an audience that you're sharing it with? Are they going to be impacted? Is there a particular community that's going to be impacted? And you might define that community as your geographic community, depending on where you live, your artistic community in terms of the practice that you have, or even your cultural community. Are they going to be impacted by this work that you're doing? Is the art form itself that you're working in going to be impacted? So those are other key considerations in who that you might want to try and speak to. Both the why and the who, as I say, relate to impact, and this is a key part of the assessment criteria. And often this is the compelling piece that engages the assessors, the people reading your applications. These are the pieces that bring your project to life in their imagination and make the assessors excited about your project in comparison to all the other ones that they're reading. Articulating how you're going to achieve your project can be a great exercise to help organize your thoughts and establish the timeline and the budget for your project, which are also key parts of your application. So a timeline or work plan or schedule, depending on what's being requested. It's also an important part of your storytelling tool. It needs to reinforce and further explain what's being presented in the more narrative parts of the grant application. And a work plan is also important in helping you determine your budget and or your expenses. So to that end, your budget is also an important part of telling your story, believe it or not. I know budgets aren't necessarily super intuitive things, but they are important to help the assessors understand how you're spending your resources. So every program has slightly different budget and expense requirements. Read the guidelines to know what expenses are eligible. I talked about this a bit earlier in terms of what's eligible and not eligible, but be aware of those things and make sure that you're not requesting funds for something that is an ineligible expense. Often, how much you can request is different from program to program. So, for example, in early career development, you can request up to 100% of your budget, but in something like performing arts project programs for creation, you have to have some other forms of revenue to supplement the funding from BC Arts Council. So depending on what stream, BC Arts Council's funding might only support 75% of your project or 50% of your project. So you need to find funds from other sources, and it's important to be aware of that as you're applying. Also, what other information needs to be provided? Some programs require quotes. They require further information on how you've arrived at artist fees. So there's a notes column in the budget, and always use that notes column. It can really help illustrate for the assessors how you arrived at these numbers. Otherwise, they might just be guessing, and that can really impede your application from succeeding. The BC Arts Council budget forms are mostly generic across programs, so just be aware that not every line is going to apply to your project. You don't need to have something in each of those line items. And if the language in the budget isn't clear or you don't understand what's being asked for, just ask questions. As I said, budgets are not necessarily intuitive, and don't be embarrassed or shy to ask questions about it with the program officers. In terms of creating your budget, create your project outline first, because then that's going to help you define what things you're going to need to spend money on. And then you can research how much those things or people might cost. And then in terms of some general tips for grant writing, you need to register in the BC Arts Council's online system. So if you're not already registered, you can have a look at that and get registered. It does take a couple of days to get processed on our side once you're registered. So don't leave that until the day before a grant deadline, because then it's not actually going to be going through in time for you to complete an application. So along those lines of thinking ahead about things, draft your application early. I know, especially for me, I'm a very last minute person. I remember all of those, all-nighters to get papers in university and stuff. Try not to approach your grants in that way, because it's great to draft it early, put it aside, come back and look at it with fresh eyes, and that will really help with clarity. Strongly recommend having somebody who doesn't know anything about you or your project read through your application. Do they understand what you're doing and why you're doing it? Can they explain your project back to you? if they're missing key components, then it's probable that the assessors are going to be missing those things as well. And sometimes we, as artists, can be really clear about something in our heads, getting it down on paper, sometimes things get lost in that translation. So having an outside eye read it can really help to determine what you've included, what's explicitly understood, and what might be missing. Be sure to read and follow the guidelines for the program for guidance, obviously. Keep the assessment criteria in mind as you're going through the application. Most programs are going to ask for support material, so keep that support material brief and focused and specific to the project that you're working on. If you're a creative writer and you're writing an application to support a play that you're working on, not necessarily going to be helpful to include a bunch of poems because it doesn't offer really direct context for that specific project that you're applying for. In general, point form is fine. Short paragraphs are fine. One long line of never-ending text that fills up the whole space can be hard for assessors to parse through. Be aware that sometimes assessors are reading 100 and more applications in a go. So anything you can do to make life easier for the assessors is going to help you and your application stand out. And this might seem obvious, but make sure you're answering the questions that are asked in the application. It's often surprising as we're going through them how often folks lose sight of this as they make their way through the application. And then if you have any questions, do reach out. That's my biggest piece of advice is the program officers are here to help you. That's our job. We help you by answering questions as you're writing your application and also providing you with feedback on your application after the assessment process. If, for example, you were unsuccessful in that intake, give us a call and we can tell you what the assessor's feedback was so that you can help yourself to write a stronger application next time. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen now and we'll see what kind of questions have come up.
Super, thanks for that, Erin. That's fantastic. There was a lot of information, of course, so don't feel bad if you're like, just type them in, ask us your questions. So we had one question right off the top. The question is, could UVic graduates from other fields, such as engineering, who do arts and are planning to take art as a profession, apply for these funds?
You could apply for scholarship if you're planning to pursue studies in an arts program that's supported by the scholarship program. But because basic training in your area of practice is part of the eligibility criteria, if you haven't yet completed that basic training, then you're probably not going to be eligible for many of our programs. But if that can be something that if you're wanting to sort of talk through the specifics of your existing practice outside of that clearly defined basic training piece, just get in touch with the program officer who runs that program and talk them through where you're coming from, and they'll be able to better determine yes or no if you're going to be eligible.
Great. Got a few questions coming in now. So are master's students eligible for professional programs while still enrolled?
Yeah, this is a piece that it's a great question because it's something that we've really been digging into over the last year because we're recognizing that there's many folks that are going back to school who already have an established professional practice. So I'll say that in the past, full-time students have not been eligible to apply for things like project assistance or individual arts awards or professional development, but that's changing. As I say, because we've really recognized that this is that just the way of the world right now, that folks are going back and doing masters or even doctorates after they are already professionals. And so it's not necessarily fair to assume that if you're, I think the original rationale was that if you're doing full-time studies, you should just, focus on that and give yourself the capacity to concentrate on doing that work. And it was sort of a feasibility consideration. Are you going to have the capacity to finish this project that you're applying for funding for if you are also concurrently doing full-time studies. But I think, again, this is changing, recognizing that people, have the ability to manage their own time and can be depended on to do the work that they propose, especially if they've already been out there in the world and have a professional practice. So I'm being a little bit vague in my answer because, as I say, it's in the process of shifting. And so you'll want to check individual programs to see what their exclusions are or are not in those areas. It can be challenging, particularly if you're planning to apply to scholarships and project assistance, because again, for some of those considerations. So look to the specific guidelines and again, take those questions to the program officers who run those programs specifically.
Great, thanks, Erin. What are the characteristics, this can be a brief one. What are the characteristics of a successful project generally and related to someone who specializes in Western art music? I don't know if you can encapsulate that down.
Yeah, Western art music. It's not a program that I run, so I have to offer that caveat up front. But I think it really comes back to the assessment criteria for any successful project. How is this work that you're doing going to impact you? Going to impact that art form? Going to impact the audience that you're bringing that art form to? Is this something that you're putting forward that is advancing the form? Is it advancing your practice and in a way in particular that may be supporting one of the strategic priorities of the BC Arts Council? Those are things that are going to stand out. I apologize that that's not a particularly specific answer to your specific question. But if you want more information about that, you can connect with Nadine Carew, who runs the music programs for the BC Arts Council. I don't know if I was clear in articulating that, we're a team of 10 program officers and we all run different programs. So I could tell you in much more detail information about the early career development program because it's one of the ones I run, but there's, lots of other programs that I have less clarity on the specifics of. So get in touch with Nadine for all questions related to music. She can dig into that more with you.
So if people are going to get in touch with somebody, how do they do that? Is it a phone? Is it a website?
Yeah, you can go to the website, look through all the programs, and for each program, you'll see right on that web page who runs that program, and that will have their direct contact information, whether it's email or phone, and we're happy to correspond by either. Be aware that the closer you get to a program deadline, the harder it is to get in touch with people because the volume of calls and emails ramps up the closer to the deadline. So again, plan early. You can also just call the direct line for the BC Arts Council, and they'll help direct your question to the program officer best positioned to answer it.
And that's bcartscouncil.ca?
No, it is, because we're a government agency, we have these slightly clunky email addresses. So it's bcartscouncil@gov.bc.ca. Okay,
great, thank you. But the website is bcartscouncil.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's fine. Both are good. Okay, next question. When does the fiscal year start that we can apply for a grant? Is it like calendar year, or is it any time during the year ahead of?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't actually set limits on how you can apply in terms of calendar years or fiscal years. Like let me see if this helps to answer your question. You can apply for activities that begin any time after the application deadline. So if the application deadline is February 1st, then activities that start on February 2nd and anytime into the future, you can apply for those activities. We can't support activities that have already started before the application deadline. Some of our programs do stipulate when you have to have completed that program by, but generally not for individuals. For individuals, we sort of leave that up to you to determine, is this a project that's only going to take you 6 months? Is it going to take you a year? Is it going to take you 2 years? That's up to you. And then the other piece of that, I had a fleeting thought that maybe has gone by now. Oh, the calendar year. Yeah. So you can also say, for example, the program that you want to apply for, the program deadline is on February 1st, but you don't actually want to start these activities until the next February. But you're not going to know if you have the funding to do that or not until probably 16 weeks after the application deadline. So you can plan quite far out into the future if you want to be sure of that funding before you start your activities. So those are some of the nuances of timing. I hope that that helps answer your question. We don't necessarily say all activities that are going to happen in 2022 need to be applied for at this point in time. That's really more determined by you and your activities and the application deadline for each program.
That's great to know that you can plan that far in advance. That's super.
Yeah, most of our programs only run once a year. So that's also something that's good to be aware of, to mark your calendars, because if you miss it, you only get one chance, with the exception of professional development, which does run more than once per year.
Which dovetails to the next question. How often are the applications reviewed or looked at? Is there a specific timeline for the application process?
Yeah, great questions. So I sort of answered that. Yeah, there's only one intake per year, and they differ depending on the program. So I can tell you the scholarship program is probably going to be opening not too far into the future. They're working on updating those guidelines right now. Early career development usually comes out those guidelines in May with a deadline in June. And usually it takes us 16 weeks to turn around a program, meaning that from the time that the application closes to the time that you receive information, whether you've received funding or not, is 16 weeks or approximately 4 months. It takes us that amount of time to process the applications in our system, make sure that they're eligible, put them forward to an assessment panel, give them enough time to review 100 applications, come together in a meeting, determine who they felt were the strongest applications that they want to support for funding. We need then to present that information sometimes to different layers of the ministry for approval. Not necessarily approval, the assessors have approval, but different levels of the ministry want to be aware of that information before it becomes public, and then we're able to let you know. So that's, if you're wondering why it takes us 4 months, that's why.
Great. How is eligibility of a professional practice proven?
That's a great question. And sometimes it's something that you do need to call your program officer to kind of talk through. Here's what I've got. Does this make me eligible? But generally, you are going to be submitting a CV or a resume as part of your application. And on that, you want to include any professional experience that you have. And again, that's not sort of volunteer things you've done or things that you were paid an honorarium for. It's things that you have. It really varies depending by discipline. So I would recommend that whatever discipline you are working in, that you go to either the individual arts awards if you're a visual artist or a media artist or a creative writer, or if you're go to the individual arts awards for those, and they will more clearly articulate what their definition of a professional artist is within those guidelines. And then if you're a performing artist, if you're a musician or a theater practitioner or a dancer, go to the performing arts projects. And again, it very clearly lays out what they mean by what constitutes 2 years of professional practice and what could be included in that.
Great. Okay, good. I'm an international student. Will I be eligible to apply if I link with a certain organization since I'm not a Canadian citizen? And can you give tips on how international students or non-Canadians can successfully apply for grants?
Yeah, that's a great question and a tricky one. As I say, because we're a agency of the BC government, our role is to support BC artists and BC-based organizations. So as a non-BC resident and a non-Canadian citizen, unfortunately, it doesn't meet that sort of basic eligibility criteria for our programs. And I think you're possibly going to run into the same challenge with Canada Council, being that they're government agencies specifically intended to support Canadian citizens. So I'm trying to think how to support you as an international student. It sort of falls outside of my realm of expertise. I know when I ran the co-op placement program where organizations could get funding to hire co-op students, arts and cultural organizations could hire co-op students to work with them, that international students that were enrolled in co-op programs could be hired. But that's about the extent of the intersection between how we're able to support international students through our programs. So I'm sorry that I can't be more help with that one.
I will say, in addition to that, you might want to look into going to UVic's international unit. They do have a tab on their website, which is uvic.ca/international. And there's a link there that says inbound funding opportunities. So that might be something to look at. Okay, next question. Is it a liability if a budget is just for living expenses during the time of a project? As an individual artist who doesn't need to rent studio space or buy many materials, expenses might only be the $2,000 per month cost of living.
Such a great question. No, that's totally fine, especially like for a program like creative writing, where all you want is time to sit in your living room or office or kitchen table or whatever it is and write something. Often that is what the budget is. It's like, I'm going to write for 3 months. I'm going to apply for $2,000 a month. So my budget is $6,000. My proposed revenues are the $6,000 I'm requesting from this grant. That is my balanced budget. The end. Yeah, that's totally fine.
Great. That was a quick answer. Let me ask you a couple. That was all the ones we had so far. If people are still listening and you want to ask more questions, feel free to type them in. We'll get to your questions. In the meantime, what are the most common mistakes people make when it comes to applying?
Yeah, let's see. Not getting in touch with the program officer before they apply.
Interesting.
Like, we really encourage, especially if it's your first grant, like if you just want to call me, if you are applying to early career development, and say, here's who I am, here's my background, am I eligible? And then we can off the bat determine if you're eligible, because I hate it when people put all this work into applying for something and then we're like, you're just not quite eligible yet, come back after this happens, right? Or you've put all this time in and you are eligible, but your project isn't eligible. So it's really good to just give the program officer a heads up, introduce yourself, talk them through your project, and then the program officer can determine if it's eligible, if you're eligible. And if it's not eligible, they could say, that isn't, but have you considered something like this, which would be eligible and can maybe help you sort of approach it from a different direction that then would be eligible. So instead of you putting forward an application that just not eligible, if you've talked to somebody in advance, then they can help you tailor that a little bit. Other challenges like basic proofreading, get somebody else to look at it that can just, this sentence doesn't make sense, or this is missing, or that kind of thing. Assessors are always approaching the applications in the spirit of generosity. They really want you to succeed. It's not like assessors are coming in and going, hate that, that's out. They would love to give money to everybody. So, if you have a really good project, but your application is marred by, incomplete sentences or missing pieces or that kind of thing, that doesn't help you rise to the top. So that's why that outside eye, or just going through it a couple of times to make sure that you've addressed things, is really smart. Other mistakes.
I imagine there's a lot of cutting and pasting that happens as well. People are taking information from one document, putting into their program information, but maybe that doesn't necessarily work. And that's where that outside eye helps a lot.
Totally. Yeah, because often assessors are like, this has very clearly been cut and paste from something else. Support material, same thing. Like sometimes people upload the wrong support material. It's a letter of support for some other project, and then it's like, that's not gonna help you. Yeah.
Sure. Here's another question that just came in. If I have professional experience in BC, but I'm in a different university program, am I still eligible for an individual grant?
You would be eligible in the discipline in which you have professional experience. So to answer that part of that question, and then in terms of where your professional experience is, that doesn't really matter. You could be a BC resident and because you've lived here for the last year and a half, but all your professional experience is from Winnipeg when you were working there. That's totally fine. It doesn't matter where your professional experience is from, but it does matter that you have lived in BC for long enough to be eligible under that residency piece.
Right. Okay, good. Follow up to that, but that doesn't fail basic training? Question mark.
Doesn't fail basic training. I'm not. Can you read the first question? Part of the question again? I just want to make sure I'm understanding it.
Experience in BC, but I'm in a different university program. Am I still eligible for an individual grant?
So if you're in a different university program, like non-arts related, I don't know, John, are you able to unmute this participant and maybe they can talk through their
I was just going to say, just with an eye to time, we're running down. Quick. Jake, this might be a good question to follow up with Erin afterwards. Give her a call,
sure.
Ask some questions and have a conversation with her about this. That might be the best way to find your answer.
If it's a scenario where you have a professional practice in one area, but now you're exploring a different practice and you're not yet sort of through your basic training in this new area of practice, we do get those questions quite a bit. And again, I would encourage you to contact us directly and walk us through where you're at in that transition, if that's what the question is.
Great. Okay, a couple more real fast ones. What if my project doesn't seem to fit any of your funding categories?
Call us. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there's some times where it's like, oh, okay, you do, circus arts. Yeah, come to theater or come to dance, or, you have a certain amount of autonomy to sort of determine what your practice is and where you see it being assessed. But yeah, there are just some practices that we don't fund. So get in touch with us and let us know what you're up to, and we can help direct you.
Okay, great. Colton just posted one more complicated question. Probably not time to discuss. Holy cow. It's going to take more time to read this out after Colton. Call Erin and have a conversation with her. Because yes, it'll be too long to answer that one. What if, do all provinces have similar funding agencies? Like if I'm a student from Winnipeg, but I happen to be here, so yeah.
Yeah, great question. Yes, the answer is yes. Okay. Yeah, all across Canada, there are funding agencies that help support that province's arts and culture activities. BC is unique in that the BC Arts Council is sort of embedded within government. So as I say, I'm a public servant. I work for the government at the agency of the BC Arts Council. Other agencies are a little bit more sort of arm's length from the governments, but they're still in place to manage those government funds. So yeah, depending on where you're from, in Winnipeg, you could apply to the Manitoba Arts Council, for example.
Okay, good. Would a fourth-year undergraduate student be eligible for a scholarship award if they are completing their full-time studies in August, i.e. a few months after the April deadline?
Ooh, good question. I would have to direct you to Anissa for that one. I'm not sure exactly how that falls into place. Like there might be a certain amount of time that you need to be enrolled in those full-time studies in order for scholarship to kick in. But yeah, get in touch with Anissa. She'll be able to easily answer that for you.
Okay, great. Can I get federal funding, e.g. Canada Council, at the same time as BC funding?
Yes, you can. You can get funding for the same project. And in fact, sometimes you'll want to include that in your budget. If you have a project that's being funded in part by Canada Council and you're coming to BC Arts Council to make up the difference in that funding, then that's great. Assessors are always excited to see that funding is already in place. That is something that really can strengthen an application. The fact that you have applied to Canada Council, even if you don't know if you've received the funding, also shows initiative on your part. Mm-hmm. And so can be a positive thing for your grant application. So if you've applied to Canada Council, you can include that in your revenues as a pending revenue, like it's not confirmed yet, but you have applied for it. So yeah, that's good to know. One thing I will note, adjacent to that question is that if you've already received BC Arts Council funding for an activity, you can't receive funding for the same activity again. So if you have a project that's sort of going to take place over many years or something, then you might want to talk to a program officer about how to approach that in a phased way so that you can receive funding for part of it and then come back and receive funding for a different part of it, because you can't just come back for the same thing.
Great. Okay, good. Are MFA students also eligible for scholarship programs?
Yes.
Great. Asked and answered. That's a simple one.
And PhD students, yeah.
And PhD students. Okay, great. So if we apply for up to $30,000, what determines how much I actually get? Is that the assessment process?
Yeah, so that's the assessment process is going to determine who gets funded and at what level they get funded. So you might be, assuming that all of your expenses are eligible, like $30,000 is, this will be specific to the early career development program. It's one of the only individual programs where you can apply for that much money. So if you apply to ECD and all of your expenses are eligible and your application has been looked upon favorably, then yeah, you could get all of that $30,000. If you've included ineligible expenses, then those would be deducted from that amount. So if you don't receive $30,000, then it might be because you've included something that isn't able to be funded. Or if you're sort of like, if you're right at the top of the list, it's likely you're going to get funded at 100%. Sometimes assessors, in order to try and stretch the funds, if you're further down the list, you might get slightly less than your request amount because they're trying to stretch the money a little bit and scaling back from a few people so that they can maybe fund one other person. That sometimes happens.
Okay. Great. Okay. Well, with that, we are right at our time limit here. I would say if people have other questions, do be in touch with Erin, the BC Arts Council. Go to the website, bcartscouncil.ca. You'll find the information out there. And Erin, I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation today and sharing your knowledge with people. And Erin just put her email in the chat box there, erin.macklem@gov.bc.ca. Thanks very much, Erin. That was fantastic.
This is awesome. Thanks, John. Great to talk to you. I hope it was helpful.
I think so. And for our students, this will be posted on the Fine Arts YouTube page, so you'll be able to find the recording there, and we'll share it around on social as well. Thanks everyone who tuned in. Thanks for the questions, and again, thanks to Erin for doing this. Have a good day.
My pleasure. Take care.
Bye-bye.